Hello, thank you all for joining us for our second Envisioning Equity series, Housing to Build a Just Recovery. I'm Marie-Frances Rivera, president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, and Mass Budget is a leading think tank advancing policy solutions that create an inclusive and thriving Commonwealth for all. In these Envisioning Equity community conversations that we've been hosting, it's our aim to look at how our state budget here in Massachusetts and all of the programs that it supports are really building economic and racial equity, particularly in communities that are hit hardest by structural racism and disinvestment. And we really believe that our Commonwealth's budget, which is how we raise revenues through taxes and fees and how we spend that revenue, is really the clearest picture of our shared values here in the Commonwealth. And equitable investments are critical. And that means to us really investing in policies and programs that bring collective well-being and joy to communities and divesting from what's harmful in our communities. And this pandemic has really shown us what little cushion people have to weather this health and economic crisis that we're in. But even before the pandemic, Massachusetts had vast divides, and they're divides that fall along race and class lines. Currently, it's estimated that there are hundreds of thousands of renters in Massachusetts that are not caught up in rent. And the state's eviction moratorium is set to expire in a little more than a week, which would prove catastrophic to many families across the state. Also, the science is really clear. It's critical that people be able to physically distance in order to stop the spread of COVID-19, which is ticking back up. But housing insecurity is currently undermining public health. And these structural inequities that we see today didn't just happen overnight. They're born of a long legacy of racist policies that include redlining in communities that have created housing segregation and many other deeply embedded divides. But we can be a beacon of anti-racist policy change here in the Commonwealth. And an anti-racist state budget, including the progressive revenue that we raise to support it, can be part of a larger effort to reverse the racist policies of past and present so that everybody, regardless of their identity or their economic status, has access to the resources they need to live the lives that they want and they deserve. I'm really excited to have these colleagues who are doing transformational work on the local, state, and national level joining us today. I'm going to briefly introduce our moderator, who is a dear mentor of mine, Vanessa Calderón-Rosado, who's going to guide us through the discussion today. So I will do a quick bio because her bio would be too extensive to cover it all here. But Vanessa Calderón is the Chief Executive Officer of Inquilinos, Boricuas, and Acción, IBA, which is a community development corporation in the South End of Boston. And under Vanessa's leadership since 2003, IBA has become the largest Latino-led nonprofit in Greater Boston. She also is a trustee at the Bar Foundation, and she became the first Latina ever to be appointed to the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. She's a founding board member of the Margarita Muñez Academy, the first dual language innovation high school in Massachusetts, and is the co-founder of the Greater Boston Latino Network, and is also hermana Puertorriqueña también. So I'm going to pass it over to Vanessa, who will set the context and who will guide us through our conversation for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie-Frances. And I'm really excited to be here this afternoon to share with you all on this important topic. I want to thank Marie-Frances Rivera, fellow Boricua of mine, and the Mass Budget staff for really creating the space for this important topic, and for inviting me to moderate this conversation and really think about what does a just and equitable recovery for housing looks like in Massachusetts. As Marie-Frances mentioned earlier, it is no secret that COVID-19 has hit the hardest the populations and communities that were among the state's most vulnerable ones. The impact of this plague has been worst in Black and Latinx neighborhoods and communities, uncovering the systemic racism and oppression that we have faced. In Boston, neighborhoods like East Boston, Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan have had the highest incidence of COVID-19 cases. And across the state, cities like Chelsea, Brockton, Lawrence, and Lynn have felt the brunt. So the pandemic has underscored how important housing is as a determinant of health and well-being. High rates of COVID-19 in these cities and neighborhoods are caused in part by families living in crowded, multi-generational households where the public health advice of physical distancing and quarantining or isolation are hard or impossible to attain. These living conditions are created by our lack of affordable housing in our region and our state. For years, and before COVID-19, we have been talking about and pointing out the crisis that we experience in housing and the systemic inequities in that system, where many families pay more than 30% of their income towards rent, pushing them to double and triple up to make ends meet. So today, we're here to talk about solutions for a just and equitable housing future for Black, Latinx, and low-income families. These solutions, as you will hear, take different shapes as we need a diverse toolbox to deal with a complex and expensive problem. Some of these solutions are more immediate, such as extending the eviction moratorium that is about to expire on October 17th, to ensure that families and children, especially children, are not displaced in an already chaotic and unstable school year, and that their evictions do not cause increases in COVID-19 cases. As for more long-term solutions that can be actually passed right now in the legislature, there's a Housing and Environment Revenue Opportunities, or HERO Act, which will double the excise tax upon the sale of real property in Massachusetts. This new revenue will generate about $300 million per year, which would be evenly split between affordable housing and climate change initiatives. Imagine that, $150 million of new revenue for housing, which will create or preserve affordable housing for over 18,000 homeowners and renters for the next decade, and also would help thousands of very low-income families with housing vouchers. Like these, there are many other budget and fiscal policy tools that can be enacted, such as Housing Choice, Tenants' Opportunity to Purchase Act, Tenants' Right to Counsel, Fair Housing Zoning Amendments, and the list goes on. So today, you will hear from a diverse array of ideas, policies, and budget proposals from a great set of panelists. These ideas are aimed to address a just and equitable housing recovery. Some of them have been sitting actually in our State House for months, even years. And some might be considered even controversial, but we are looking to solving a complex housing crisis, and all hands need to be on deck. So I'll stop here because I really want you to hear from our panelists' perspectives. With these challenges as a context, I first want to introduce you to our keynote speaker this afternoon, Peggy Bailey. Peggy is the Vice President of Housing Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C., which is a nonpartisan research and policy institute and think tank. The Center on Budget focuses on federal and state policies designed both to reduce poverty and inequality, and also to restore fiscal responsibility in equitable and effective ways. Peggy at the center oversees the work that is designed to protect and expand access to affordable housing for people with low incomes. Throughout her career, she has helped build connections between the housing community and the health, nutrition, and child welfare systems. Her experience spans from Director of Health Systems Integration for the Corporation for Supportive Housing, as well as the National Alliance to End Homelessness, among others. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Peggy Bailey. Peggy.
Thank you, Vanessa. And hello, everyone, virtually. We're all getting used to this. I'm really excited to be here today. And my charge is to, take some of the themes that Marie Frances and Vanessa talked about and explain a little bit more about how we're specifically thinking about what housing justice really means. Next slide. So I want to start with just centering us in what we've already said, right? That housing justice and racial justice go hand in hand. Because of past policies that created the racial disparities in housing access, in location of housing, and then that's led to disparities in healthcare, education, and other issues. We can't have housing justice if we don't also address racial justice. What's been really interesting for us at the center is we've engaged in a cross-sector partnership called the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. And when we started that campaign, it was just about helping cross-sector partners engage in housing advocacy. Along the way, we realized, those of the leading organizations realized we needed to engage in racial equity issues too, but we weren't sure if our partners would engage in that conversation because we hadn't really talked about race. Well, once we brought it up with them, they were like, thank God, we've been waiting for you guys to center race in your work, because the work that they had done to center race is what brought them to the housing table. They realized that they couldn't get better outcomes in education, in child welfare, in wealth building, if they didn't also address the housing needs for people and the inequities that exist. The other piece of that we've also mentioned is that these policies intentionally happened. There are policies that were put in place the policies were put in place intentionally. Sometimes the outcomes weren't intentional, but they still are due to the policies and practices that have been in place in the housing sector. So therefore, it means that we can't just sit by and expect for things to change. We need to intentionally address the inequities and do that with an anti-racist frame. One thing, all of our missions are about affordable housing, but I just want to be clear that affordable housing and racial justice are not equal, right? That would be racist. Not all people of color are low income, and there are definitely racial injustices that happen for homeowners and others. But for this conversation, obviously we're going to be centering affordability because that's the mission of all of us. But I want to be clear because that equating those two things happens far too often. We're obviously also going to be focused on people with the lowest incomes at the center. That's where our work lies. So a lot of what I work on is around the housing choice voucher program and other housing rental assistance programs like public housing in looking at how to improve them to do better when it comes to serving low-income people broadly, but also the role that they can play in correcting the injustices of the past. Also, we'll talk a lot about housing, and we need to tease that out some, right? Especially for if you're a housing person and engaging cross-sector partners, or to remember that housing isn't just about supply. Because of also rental assistance needs to be included to have a complete solution. Even programs like the low-income housing tax credit that we rely on so much for affordable housing supply doesn't meet the needs of people with the lowest incomes. And we have to be honest about the fact that we're not going to build housing that's cheap enough for people at the lowest incomes. So what are the solutions needed to build, because it costs money to build buildings, but also wrap around a housing subsidy really intentionally so that we can make sure that housing is affordable for people with the lowest or no income, and that we correct the mistakes that public housing has led us to when it comes to segregation. Along those lines around supply, we also have to pay attention to location. And in thinking about anti-racist policies, we have to think about disrupting this idea that segregation equates to poor outcomes, because it is not inherently true that if too many Black and brown people live together, bad outcomes happen. What happens when we segregate people is then we can disinvest in them and then bad outcomes happen. So we have to disrupt the narrative that it's going to take gentrification in order to make communities better, communities better. We need to we need to do this intentional investment in communities of color and help them thrive, and create incentives to help people stay in the communities that they already live in. And lastly, what's really important and I'm excited to talk about today is the link between national advocacy and community organizers. There's been a disconnect there that we have to correct for so that we can speak with one voice. Because one thing is true in housing policy, whether it's at the state or local or federal level, is if we don't speak with one voice, nothing happens, because we struggle to build the political will for policymakers to try to fight through conflict. Next slide. So just quickly, I want to highlight some of the things that are on the table from a federal level. We just actually this afternoon, we learned that there are probably going to be stalled talks in the pandemic relief measures, but you should know that there are dollars on the street that you can be advocating that go to both the state and local level to do work in the housing space. And and there's $4 billion in homelessness and eviction prevention. There were $3 billion for vouchers in the public housing program. Those were for existing programs. And I should have put on here that there was $5 billion for the Community Development Block Grant Program, which also goes to states and localities. And they're just making decisions now on how those dollars should be spent. There were more investments in the HEROES Act and HEROES 2.0 that passed the House. There's also the eviction moratorium, but there are no dollars related to that. It just attempts to halt evictions, and we can tell so far that that's been spotty. And it's unclear how, although we're optimistic that once a relief package happens, that state and local dollars will get included. As far as 2021 and thinking forward, it's exciting that the Biden campaign has included a housing entitlement for all who are eligible, and that if Vice President Biden wins, that'll be a focus for the housing community, trying to figure out how do we get there, how do we get to housing for all. If President Trump wins, we'll be working on protecting fair access to housing and shelter and rental assistance for marginalized populations. And just to hone in on the state budget implications, obviously, to do the things that need to happen for housing investment at the state level, we need to focus on, how to use state dollars that are existing better, but also look at revenue generation. And I know Mass Budget has worked on issues around the flat tax system that Massachusetts has, and trying to correct for that will help drive some investment. When I was at the Corporation for Supportive Housing, I worked in Massachusetts on the Social Impact Bond Initiative that's looking at high cost users of the healthcare system. But for everyone else, it's going to be, strengthening Massachusetts's long-standing state voucher program and driving further investment into that is going to be particularly important. And changing from this cost effectiveness argument to more of an equity argument will be essential in that. So with that, I will pass it back to Vanessa.
Thank you, Peggy. Okay, let's see if I can start my video again. Okay, doesn't seem like I can start my video, but hopefully people can hear me, because what I like to do now is, there you go. Thank you, technology. So thank you so much, Peggy, for setting this framework, especially on how do we change the narrative to ensure that we disrupt, you know, the racist thoughts about how do we think about housing and how do we think about solving the problem of housing. So now I would like to quickly introduce our three panelists. We'll react to Peggy's commentary, but also we'll talk about their own work that they're doing to ensure that there's a just and equitable housing recovery. First, I would like to introduce Bob Terrell, who is a part-time lecturer in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. And he's also the Fair Housing, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the Boston Housing Authority. Many of you locally know Bob, as he's also a member of the Roxbury Neighborhood Council, and he has been a staunch advocate for fair housing in our city. His areas of research are many and include housing, gentrification and displacement, civil rights, and public policy. Next, I will introduce Fairey, a new colleague of mine and the new executive director of Wayfinders in Springfield. Wayfinders is a community development corporation which confronts homelessness head-on in communities throughout Western Massachusetts, including Hampden and Hampshire counties. Wayfinders has developed targeted services that help people lift themselves up and out of homelessness. And last, but certainly not least, Lisa Owens, who is the executive director of City Life Vida Urbana, a grassroots community organization in Boston committed to helping people stay in their homes by fighting for working class power and racial, social, and economic justice and gender equity. Assistant educator, Lisa also has taught a number of college courses on structural racism, U.S. social welfare policy, participatory action research, and nonprofit management leadership. So what I'd like to do is now open it up to the panel, and I would like to give each of our panelists approximately 4 minutes to react to Peggy's framework and also to talk about what they're doing and what we should be doing to ensure just and equitable housing recovery. So let me start with Bob.
Thank you very much. That wonderful introduction. And Peggy, excellent presentation. There are two things that really stood out to me in terms of your presentation. One is this notion, I think you touched on it, where we have to come up with new language. Segregation doesn't completely describe the phenomena that we see in regional housing markets. And every time that people of color form a community, it is not always in response to racism or discrimination. There are lots of proactive and positive reasons why people form communities, and we should be doing more to help folks get the resources and the political power to really build out their communities. There is a theory going around referred to as opportunity theory, where they define some communities as high opportunity and some as low opportunity, and that the way in which you improve communities who are so-called low opportunity is to scatter the population and make them move into high opportunity communities. And to suggest such a thing at a time when we're up against a lot of gentrification displacement is really a crazy idea. But this concept has made its way into all of our housing policies. You hear this opportunity rhetoric everywhere we go. And it's premised on a very racist set of statements and assessments about communities of color. And that is something I think we need to lift up. We need to root that out of all of our housing policies.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that perspective. I'd like to turn it over to Keith now.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. And thanks for the opportunity to be here on the panel today. I speak to you from Springfield, Massachusetts, in the western part of the state. And I wanted to just shine a little light on some of the things that Peggy talked about with some data. We have the benefit of working on the Greater Springfield Housing Study right now with the UMass Donahue Institute and the Community Foundation of Western Massachusetts. And I just want to say, often folks have a good sense of things in the eastern part of the state, but in our study, we're finding and shining a light on some of the issues that Peggy mentioned here. This is an increasingly diverse part of the state, with exceeding diversity overall for the state in terms of people of color in the region growing rapidly in this region. When we talk about income and economic impacts that people have felt, they go well beyond the pandemic. When we look at the recovery from the Great Recession, the western part of the state recovered much slower and lagged behind the rest of the state significantly. You can see that in lots of data, but I'll pull a couple things out quickly just to point that out and then bring that back to the housing story here that we're talking about and the need for an equitable and just recovery. Poverty rates here are higher than the state average. And when you break them down by race, there are significant disparities. But in each race, white, Black, Asian, and Latinx, you see much higher rates of poverty than you see for the state overall, with the biggest disparity being for Latinx populations here. State poverty rate is 27%. In the Pioneer Valley here is 38%. And those disparities, again, are the same for white, Black, and Asian households, at least 5% greater than the state. Employment growth on the other end of it lags behind the state. So weaker economy out here, which again will undermine our ability to recover from the pandemic. With the employment growth at the state level from 2010 to 2018 being at 13.9%. But here in our region, the average is well under 10%, in some parts of the region under 5% in terms of employment growth. Unemployment rate, again, going back to the Great Recession and up until the pandemic, our unemployment rate was higher. And during the pandemic, some of our cities and localities have had extremely high unemployment, with Springfield being the highest at 25.9%. It's down a bit, just under 20 now, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. As we know, many workers are discouraged or not counted in that number, and we haven't really seen a recovery there. Bringing that into housing, cost burdens are high here, like many parts of the state. Those cost burdens, though, hit households differently, with 45% of white households being cost burdened, paying more than 30% of their income for housing costs, whereas Black households are at 53% and Latinx households at 56% cost burdens. And just to give a final point here on renters and who are renters here, as we talk about this just recovery that we're looking toward, and who's going to need help when we look at this. In terms of looking at housing tenure, renters skew again toward people of color. So 27% of white households are renters, while 64% of Black households are renters, and 77% of Latinx households are renters here. So folks who are really being impacted due to COVID, with some of the challenges around rental housing, both in crowding and otherwise, with the need to distance and so on, you can see there who will be most impacted and who is most impacted today. In longer term, we have a huge housing supply gap. So yes, there need to be, as Peggy mentioned, there needs to be solutions that really look at this as, we've been talking about this up to this point before the pandemic of the housing crisis. With these economic statistics, I'm calling this a housing emergency. And we need to really come up with solutions to get to recovery. We're not in recovery, to get us to recovery. And to me, that's solutions that include things like a short-term voucher that is really tied to some of these economic indicators that can help in this moment, and other things like looking at ways to help small landlords who are critical providers of affordable housing and don't provide necessarily subsidized affordable housing, but unsubsidized affordable to so many people in our cities and towns across Western Massachusetts and across the state and the country. So those are just some thoughts and reflections upon Peggy's comments, and I look forward to further discussion today.
Okay, thank you so much, Keith, for your comments and your thoughts and the sobering statistics that you see in Western Mass, which are, you know, if you go to other gateway cities across the state, you see very similar patterns. Now, let me introduce Lisa Owens, the Executive Director of City Life, Vida Urbana, to give her remarks before we go into questions. There you go, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And thank you, Bob and Keith, for your remarks as well. Yeah, I will not, I'll try not to repeat what my colleagues have been saying. I think my 3 takeaways from Peggy's remarks are, one, that housing justice definitely does equal racial justice, and the need to center race is critically important if we're going to reverse the decades and decades of impact due to these very intentionally targeted policies that had severe impact for all of our communities across the state, and particularly for Black and Latino communities. The remark about it's important to not just address supply, but the need to talk about rental assistance as well, I want to highlight and say yes. And it is also critically important to invest in preservation strategies, like taking rental housing that's privately owned by these large corporations. And in the event that large corporations are unwilling to do what is required to house people in a safe and an affordable way, right? We advocate for nonprofits like community development corporations or community land trusts to buy these properties from these large corporate landlords, so that we can have permanent affordability, and so that we can increase the stock of land and housing that is owned and governed by the community. And the last thing that I want to highlight from what Peggy was saying is just how important it is to disrupt this narrative that somehow gentrification makes things better, when in fact we know what makes communities better is strategic, targeted investment to communities of color, and new policy that is not race neutral, but that is intended to undo the decades of harm. And just in terms of giving a local context, so City Life is in the greater Boston area, and we share many of the statistics that I think that we've been hearing. So I won't belabor the point, but in Boston too, as well as around the state, communities of color are still more at risk of eviction. That was true pre-COVID, and it is certainly true now in this COVID-19 era. We co-authored a report with our colleagues, some colleagues at MIT, that looked at the eviction and displacement risk of communities of color, and found, unsurprisingly, that people of color are and were disproportionately impacted by eviction and displacement before COVID-19. And as you heard from Vanessa earlier, these are the same communities that have been hit the hardest by COVID-19, while we are reeling from the economic impacts connected to shutting down the state. So mass evictions, we are at the brink of easily 100,000 plus households who will be facing eviction after the moratorium ends next week. This will lead to, we believe, mass evictions, and this will have a devastating impact on people of all backgrounds across the state, but particularly it'll harm people of color in working class neighborhoods like Springfield and like Boston and like Worcester and like Framingham the hardest. Another point I want to raise is that our study and our ongoing kind of study of the economic situation tells us that increasing numbers of people are, one, unable to pay the rent, and so are using unsustainable methods to pay their housing costs. Things like using credit cards and borrowing money from friends and family, or relying on short-term stimulus payments or unemployment payment, right? So just, one study that came out that said towards the end of the summer said that toward the end of July, 1 in 3 Massachusetts renters who had little to no confidence in paying their August rent were relying on credit cards, loans, stimulus payments, and unemployment insurance to pay for their monthly household expenses. And 1 in 4 borrowed money from family and friends. This is absolutely precarious. This shows the precarious situation that renters and small homeowners happen to be in right now. We're still in the middle of a public health emergency. As we know, the number of cases overall continue to climb, and public health officials are bracing for yet another wave of coronavirus infections. And because the governor does not intend to extend the moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, it will end on October 17th. This will put tens of thousands of Massachusetts residents, tenants, homeowners, and small landlords alike at risk of displacement next week. This is an emergency. I think I heard Vanessa or someone say this is an all hands on deck situation. We agree. We have a week and a half left to act before these 100,000 plus households across the state will face this wave. And we think that although there are a number of worthy policy solutions that we could be talking about, but in this moment, that we believe that the absolute necessity is passing H5018, which is the Act to Guarantee Housing Stability. This bill provides the key elements needed, we think, to protect public health and move toward an equitable recovery. And we really have no time to waste.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I think we all critically understand the challenge and the emergency, how urgent this issue is, and how we need to act about it and on it right away. I would like to turn a little bit our focus and our attention to talk about programs that seem to be successful in removing barriers, and that we can either continue to build on or use to ensure that our families don't face housing instability. So I would like to turn that question to our panel. I'm not sure if you would like to start, Bob. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. This was a very difficult question for me to fathom over the past couple of days, because all of the comments that our panel has made today about the nature and seriousness of the crisis that we face was repeated at a fair housing conference that Keith's organization played a major role in organizing last Thursday and Friday. It was an excellent conference, and these very issues were raised in day 2 of the conference, and we had a very long and thoughtful conversation about it. The governor has to be forced, if necessary, to extend that moratorium, to have hundreds of thousands of people displaced and turned out in the streets, and at the same time, vacating a lot of properties that may or may not even get rented up again. We would end up with folks out in the street looking for a place to live and a plethora of empty buildings. And what does that say about the kind of society we've become and the kind of economy that we live in? And there was something Keith mentioned just a minute ago about how did we get to this point? I was reflecting on the fact that the private housing market in this country has made it abundantly clear in every venue that they have available to them that they cannot build affordable housing for low and moderate people in this country at the numbers and at the levels that we need. And they have been saying this for 6 or 7 decades. This isn't something new. So when I'm reflecting on all of the state and federal and local programs that we have for housing, and I look at the fact that we've been in the midst of this housing crisis for 60 or 70 years, what does that say about those programs? What it tells me is that the programs were designed to manage the crisis, but not to resolve the crisis. And until we really get honest with ourselves and admit that the current way in which our housing and real estate industries and markets function, we will be right back here a decade from now having the same conversation. We have to, in my opinion, we have to establish 2 very important principles post-COVID, because we can't go back to what was considered status quo or normal. I think that ship has sailed. I think that system is broken. One, we have to make it very clear that housing is a human right, number one. And number two, we have to develop a housing market or a housing system that is non-speculative and does not treat housing as a commodity to be traded and sold. If we don't confront that, we can have all the government programs we wish, and some people will benefit from those programs, and I'm glad that they do. But we will never completely resolve this crisis until we face that dilemma. We cannot pretend that post-COVID, we're just gonna go back to normal and go back to a situation that was very negative already. We have to do something better.
Yeah.
I would agree with Lisa that, you know, the current proposals going through the legislature and calling for an extension of the moratorium. It's a $200 million package, I think. I think it should be $400 to $600 million. And I think the moratorium should be extended a year or two beyond the state of emergency.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because obviously I think we all agree that the extension of the moratorium is critical, and it's the first thing that we probably should be concentrating all of our efforts and energy right now. In addition to that, what else should we need to be doing? Because that is not going to be enough, and that's going to be a short-term solution or a solution for the term, to whatever the moratorium is extended to, whether it's till the end of this year, whether it's for 1 year. What are other tools, policy, fiscal, and budget tools that we have to help support the families beyond, in addition to extended moratorium?
Yeah, let me jump in here, because we actually, at this point, the moratorium has already been extended one time to October. And that really was, so, and as someone said, that kicks the can down the road. Our Homes for All Massachusetts Coalition is saying actually that our demand is not to extend the moratorium. Our demand is to pass this piece of legislation, which is both, which is a recovery piece of legislation. So this legislation does not extend the moratorium. Instead, it takes COVID-19 debt and it makes that not allowable for eviction. So it draws a red line around all of that debt that renters are currently in, and it says a landlord cannot recover possession of their unit because of this particular COVID-19 debt. Instead, the bill says that there need to be funds prioritized for small landlords and working class homeowners who rely on this rent and without this rent themselves are at risk of displacement. We need to prioritize existing public resources to support those people. So it takes eviction out of the equation, and instead it focuses all of our attention on these small landlords and small homeowners who need this relief right now. In addition to that, the bill actually So it is a moratorium on foreclosures, and it says for all of those missed mortgage payments, the bank is required to, if you'd like to, tack those missed mortgage payments on the end of the loan, and then you have a longer time to figure out how to make those missed payments, and certainly you have this housing stability fund. It's super important to do that. The last thing I'll say is that we believe that the $800 million or so that's still sitting in from the coronavirus relief fund needs to be prioritized for this purpose. So our estimate is, if the state decided to cover the arrearage, the back rent, and the back mortgage of the people who are most vulnerable, that would cost somewhere between $400 and $700 million. So we need real policy that is going to put the needs of working class Black and Latino communities at the center. And this is a way to use public dollars to do that.
Yeah, and I would
go ahead, Keith.
You raised this, Vanessa, in the beginning. Right to counsel, there's a proposal to pilot right to counsel. Right to counsel doesn't need a pilot, it needs to be implemented fully. As we look toward any future, whether it's a more extended moratorium or any of the resources that Lisa was talking about coming to fruition, the lack of representation for people in housing court creates a great imbalance and leads to huge housing displacement for folks across the state and across the country. As I look here in the region too, I also want to bring out the fact that we talk a lot here in this conversation so far about our urban communities and gateway cities and Boston and such, but there are in the western part of the state, we have lots of rural communities that also have real needs here that relate to both needs of rent for homeowners and small landlords, which provide the majority of affordable housing in our rural communities, who again need the kind of stabilization funds Lisa is talking about. We have bailed out lots of folks over the time when we look going back to the Great Recession, but we really need to, when we talk about small business and all of that kind of stuff, we really need to put our resources where they are needed here in terms of the small landlords. So without them, the subsidized stock is a small part of what's being provided in terms of affordability in our state. And we will lose that stock perhaps permanently if we do not act now. So as I said before, this is a real need to be proactive in the moment in many of the ways that have been talked about to reframe the conversation, not just about getting to recovery, as Bob was talking about, to going back, but going forward for meaningful gains. And for me, that's about the right to counsel. That's about things like the Hero Coalition that you mentioned as well, new resources that will stabilize people long-term, as well as the immediate needs that are going to be needed to actually get us out of this relief phase to a recovery that can be one that is just and equitable, that has long-term resources for stabilizing families. At Wayfinders, we also are a rental assistance administrator. So we administer emergency rental assistance and MRVP, Massachusetts rental vouchers, and Section 8. Our Section 8 and rental voucher, we have thousands of people on waiting lists for years, right? And so the last time we pulled people off was 2006 in terms of they dated back that's when their original application. So that's unacceptable. And as Bob was talking about, housing as a human right, a budget should reflect the values that we have. And from my value, that's what we need to be focused on, is that making sure that folks are stably housed and not taking the resources that are coming forward that we have now from the federal government, and those, as Peggy was talking about, those that will come forward, and then holding ourselves and our government accountable for spending those in ways that are just and equitable through many of the solutions that were described today.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. I would like to take a little pause here to see if there are questions from the audience for our panelists, or comments on your great insights and ideas and call to action. So let me just take a quick look and see if Mary Frances has some of the comments from the audience. Okay, let me see. Okay, I think I see a couple here. Let me just go. And this one is from our friend, Rich Giordano from Fenway CDC, who he says he thinks along with a just state housing budget, we also need to advocate for a just federal housing creation program. We need to fully fund a fully funded and functioning housing and urban development agency that ensures large-scale rental assistance while it funds the production of new affordable housing. So I think we're all in agreement, and that is an important underscoring of the upcoming election and how critical it is for everyone to go out and vote, not only in Massachusetts, but especially in other states where your vote is highly critical. So I think that we agree with Rich, so thank you for that. I think there is a question that, what is your opinion on the landlord tax credit included in the bill? Is that necessary? Is that a necessary piece of recovery? There's a question. And I think probably that goes more to Lisa's on the housing recovery bill.
Yeah, we actually think that it's a good idea, as long as we are prioritizing the resources of the Housing Stability Fund itself for the people who are most impacted by displacement. This is, I think, a good complement to that piece of the bill.
Yeah, very good. There's another question here about what are implementable strategies that can be used to fund community land trusts to make deed-restricted properties that are affordable in perpetuity. For example, in Somerville, there's a newly established CLT or community land trust, but there is a shortage of funds to actually acquire properties. Any thoughts about that, Keith, Lisa, Bob?
Yeah, so with community land trusts, before you mentioned the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, all those things require resources and funds to be able to make them actually actionable at any scale that would be difference making. So if you look down to the District of Columbia, which has, for example, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and has had it for many years, they partner that with a site acquisition fund that's made available to the tenants and their developer of their choosing to acquire and rehab their buildings. It's not enough money though. And so it's not really changing the market, it's saving certain buildings. But so the opportunity here to get scaled solutions is going to require scaling the resources with any of these things. CLTs are an incredibly great way to do that long term and have the permanency that Lisa was talking about. But to get in the game and have a difference-making effect, we need resources for acquisition, and we need capacity to be built among tenants and CLTs as well, so they can strengthen themselves for long-term sustainability. So that needs to be funded as well. Otherwise, all of those things can come crumbling down pretty quickly if folks are not, that capacity is not built.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I just got a cue that our time has come up to come to an end. Unfortunately, there's so much more that we can talk about, but so little time. So hopefully we will continue this conversation offline and through Mass Budget and through our own organizations and other active groups like MACDC, CHAPA, and others who are advocating for these policies across the state. I think Lisa put on the chat the bill number, but I know people have been asking. The bill number is H5018. But let me turn it over now to Mary Frances Rivera from Mass Budget to close us out and to tell us about next steps. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our audience today.
Thank you all. That was so informative. I'm gonna rewatch that a couple times just to get all the really good nuggets. And I know we had a lot of questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to answer. But what we can do is send people who made it on the webinar today and also people who registered just a list of resources with the bill numbers and all of the resources that we mentioned. So I just want to give a big thank you to Peggy, to Vanessa, to Lisa, to Keith, Bob, and people on the mass budget team who've worked really hard too on the back end to pull this conversation together. And, you know, I think the main takeaway here is just that there is urgency and that we need resources in order to keep people housed. So, you know, we can send out resources, and, you know, I'm sure there are people that were with us today that are, you know, have been engaged in this conversation, in this series of conversations for a long time. And hopefully there were people who maybe aren't as engaged in the conversation and can join and help us really put some pressure on the governor and our elected officials to really move. We're like you all said, we're in emergency mode. So there is true urgency around figuring out how the state budget and perhaps federal funds and other resources are really going to come to bear to help us out here and the families who need it in the Commonwealth. So I think there was a slide that was going to be shown just to close us out a little bit. So one thing that I'll mention, because you were all really great in mentioning the HEROES Act, which is a revenue policy that would bring in money for housing and for the environment through our state budget. But there are also other progressive revenue solutions that we can look at in order to fund many of the bills that were mentioned and many other things, resources that we need here in the Commonwealth. So those are flashed up on your screen. There's a campaign called Investing in Our Recovery through Raise Up Massachusetts that has 3 different parts to it. One is looking at really raising corporate taxes, you know, corporations who are profitable at this time to be paying their fair share to make sure that everybody in the Commonwealth has access to opportunity and to the basic needs. And there are also other parts of the platform around offshore, you know, profits that get offshored. And then lastly, a policy around increasing the tax rate on unearned income. And so if you want more information on that, we'll also send it out, but it's linked down below. And thank you again to our panelists, to our moderator. This was an excellent conversation and really impossible to fit into an hour. So I really appreciate you all coming so prepared. We have a final webinar in our Envisioning Equity series that's going to be coming up on October 20th at 4 p.m. And that one's really going to be around reimagining our criminal legal system and talking about how the state budget and the criminal legal system interact and what we can do to make sure that we're reducing harm to our communities in that section of the budget. So thank you all for joining. And that's going to be co-hosted by ACLU Massachusetts. Thank you all for joining and have a wonderful evening.